The cold that settled over the Cavett Trail in November wasn't the kind you could prepare for, no matter how many winters you'd survived in Cape Breton. It came off the Atlantic in sheets, carrying salt and ice, and a particular kind of loneliness that pressed itself against your skin like wet wool. Wren Calloway had lived her whole 24 years on this island, and she still wasn't used to it. She found him on the rocks below McLeod's Point, just after the sun gave up trying. The kayak had broken apart on the reef. She could see pieces of orange fiberglass catching the last gray light as she scrambled down the path her grandfather had worn into the cliff face over 40 years of checking his lobster traps. She'd spotted the wreck from the Lighthouse road, a smear of color against the black water that didn't belong there, and she'd gone down without thinking twice about it, the way you do when you've grown up on a coast that swallows people whole. He was alive, barely, wedged between two granite boulders, half out of the water, one arm hooked around a rusted iron mooring ring that had no business still being there. She'd always meant to report it to the municipality. She was glad now she hadn't. Wren got her arms under his and dragged. He was heavier than he looked, broad through the shoulders, his wetsuit doing exactly nothing to protect him from the temperature of that water. She got him up the path by sheer stubbornness and a grip her father had always said was unladylike for a girl her size. Her knees were bleeding by the time she got him through the door of the keeper's cottage. The lighthouse itself hadn't been operational since the 80s. The cottage was hers, inherited from her grandmother, full of quilts and mismatched mugs and the particular smell of cedar and old paperbacks that Wren had loved since she was small enough to fit under the kitchen table. She laid him on the couch nearest the wood stove and immediately started stripping the wetsuit away from his arms. He was shaking so hard the couch frame rattled. He came awake when she reached for the zipper that ran along the collar of the suit, just beneath the base of his throat. His hand came up fast, faster than a man half drowned should have been capable of. He caught her wrist, not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to stop her cold. "Don't." His voice came out wrecked, more gravel than sound. "Please, don't open that." Wren sat back on her heels and looked at him. His eyes were open, dark gray, the color of the water she'd pulled him out of, and they were focused on her with an intensity that had nothing to do with delirium. This wasn't a man confused about where he was. He knew exactly where he was. He just didn't want her to see what was underneath. "You're hypothermic," she said, keeping her voice level, the way her mother had taught her to speak to frightened animals. "That suit needs to come off, or your body temperature is going to keep dropping. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand." He swallowed. His jaw was shaking, teeth clicking together with every breath. "Just give me a minute." "You don't have a minute to give." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him calculating something behind those gray eyes, measuring her, deciding. Then he closed them, and his hand dropped away from her wrist, and he turned his face toward the back of the couch. "All right," he said, barely a whisper. "All right, but whatever you see, I need you to understand it's not what it's going to look like." Wren didn't answer. She unzipped the collar, then worked the suit down his shoulders with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd taken a wilderness first aid course twice and had actually needed it once before, the summer a tourist fell into the gorge near Englishtown. She peeled the neoprene back from his torso, and then she stopped. Later she would try to describe the moment to herself and keep failing. It wasn't fear exactly. It wasn't surprise exactly. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was the particular vertigo of having the floor of the world tilt under you without warning, strapped to his chest with a length of waterproof adhesive tape and wrapped in 2 layers of clear plastic, pressed directly over his sternum as if he'd been trying to keep it warm with his own heartbeat, was a photograph. Not a digital print, an old photograph, the kind developed on proper paper, with that slightly glossy surface and the soft colors of a film camera. A woman in her 40s, standing in front of a clapboard building with a hand-painted sign above the door. She was laughing at whoever was behind the camera, her dark hair loose around her face, one hand raised as if she'd been mid-sentence when the shutter clicked. Beneath the photograph, also sealed in plastic, was a folded piece of paper. Through the wrapping, Wren could make out the letterhead at the top, the red and gold crest of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. She sat back on the floor. The wood stove ticked and popped. Outside, the wind off the water hit the cottage windows like a flat hand. "Who is she?" Wren asked quietly. The man on the couch opened his eyes. He looked at the photograph in her hands, and the expression that moved across his face was something she would carry with her for a long time afterward. Grief and fury, and something else underneath. Some raw, unfinished thing that hadn't found its shape yet. "Her name was Constance Briard," he said. "She was a Crown prosecutor out of Halifax. She was building a case against a man named Alain Voss." He paused, swallowed again. "She was also my mother." Wren's hands went very still. "Was," she said. "She died 14 months ago." His voice didn't break. It just flattened, the way ice does when the weight on it gets too heavy. "Car accident," they said. "Black ice on the Trans-Canada outside of Truro." Except my mother had driven that highway in January for 20 years without incident, and the brake line on her car had been cut so cleanly that the forensic mechanic said it could only have been done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And the RCMP document? The last brief she filed, the one that named Voss directly. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, still shaking but less violently now. The wood stove was doing its work. It was supposed to be submitted to the Trial Coordination Office the morning she died. It never arrived. Her assistant said she brought it home the night before to make final edits. When they searched her house afterward, it was gone. Except it wasn't. She mailed it to me 3 days before she died. He said it like he'd been holding the words in his chest for 14 months, and they'd finally gotten too heavy. No note, just the brief, the photograph, and a sealed envelope with my name on it that I wasn't supposed to open until I needed to. I didn't understand what she was doing. I didn't understand until the accident, and by then I was already being followed. Wren looked at him. This waterlogged stranger on her grandmother's couch with her grandmother's quilt starting to warm him and her own hands still holding the photograph of his dead mother, and felt something shift in her chest, not pity, something closer to recognition. The particular weight of being the person left holding a thing that other people wanted badly enough to do terrible things to get. "What's your name?" she asked. "Sebastian," he said. "Sebastian Moreau. Wren Calloway." She set the photograph carefully on the side table. "And how close are they?" He looked at her sharply. "The people following you," she said. "How close?" Something in his face changed then. A fraction of the tension went out of it, as if he'd been braced for a different kind of response, and her practical question had caught him off guard. "I lost them in the strait," he said. "I came out on the kayak from Englishtown. I knew they'd expect a car." He exhaled slowly, "But the weather came in faster than the forecast said. I didn't make it to where I was headed." "Where were you headed?" "There's a retired judge I know in Ingonish. He was a colleague of my mother's. I thought if I could get the brief to him, he could." Sebastian stopped. His jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter now. I don't think I'm going to be kayaking anywhere for a while." Wren stood up and moved to the window. She looked out at the dark. The white caps were just visible in the light that spilled from the cottage, pale and ragged. The road to the point was empty as far as she could see, but the fog was coming in thick from the east, and visibility was dropping by the minute. "Alain Voss," she said, keeping her eyes on the road. "The man your mother was building a case against." What was the case? Money laundering. Fraud. About $60 million cycled through a network of fishing company subsidiaries along the South Shore. A pause. and the deaths of 3 people who tried to testify against him over the past 8 years, each one ruled an accident. So your mother was the 4th. Yes. Wren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my Uncle Bertrand sits on the provincial court in Sydney. He's been trying to get someone to look at Voss's companies for 3 years. He keeps hitting walls. He told me last spring that someone very senior was running interference, and he didn't know who, and it was making him nervous enough that he'd stopped talking about it on his work phone. She turned away from the window and found Sebastian watching her with that same measuring look from before, except now there was something else in it too. How do you know I'm not one of them? He asked. Not aggressive, genuinely curious. I don't, Wren said simply, but you were alone in a kayak in November, in a wetsuit with your dead mother's photograph taped to your chest, and that's not the behavior of someone running a cover-up. That's the behavior of someone who's got nothing left to lose except the truth. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had taken on that particular low moan it made when the fog rolled in off the water, a sound Wren had heard her whole life and had never entirely made her peace with. I need to contact the judge in Ingonish, Sebastian said. Armand Thibodeau. If I can get the brief to him, I know Armand Thibodeau. Wren crossed back to the couch and handed him the photograph. He came to my grandmother's funeral. They were in the same book club for 20 years. She picked up her phone from the kitchen counter. Get some heat into you. I'll call him. She watched his face when she said it, the way the careful control in it slipped, just for a moment, revealing something younger and more exhausted underneath. A man who'd been carrying something alone for a very long time and hadn't known until just now how much he needed someone else to help hold it. She went into the back bedroom to make the call and gave him the privacy to feel it. Armand answered on the 3rd ring, which was fast for a man in his 70s who kept his phone in his cardigan pocket and frequently forgot which pocket. Wren had known him since she was 7 years old. She'd been a flower girl at his daughter's wedding. She told him what she had in her living room, and there was a long silence on the line. Constance Moreau's son, he said, and his voice had something in it that Wren had never heard from Armand before, a particular furious grief. I've been waiting 14 months for that brief to surface. I was beginning to think Voss had gotten to it. Can you come? I'll be there in 40 minutes. Another pause. Wren. Is the boy all right? She looked through the open doorway at Sebastian, who had managed to pull the quilt around his shoulders and was sitting up, holding his mother's photograph with both hands. He'll be all right, she said. She meant it as a practical assessment. She was less prepared for how much she would mean it in other ways before the night was over. She made tea. She made it the way her grandmother had made it. Black, strong, with enough honey to make your back teeth ache. And she brought it to Sebastian and sat in the armchair across from him and let the silence be what it needed to be for a while. He didn't try to fill it. She appreciated that. Men who needed to fill silences made her tired. After a while, he said, she never told me what she was working on. 14 years a Crown prosecutor, and she never brought the job home. She said it was important to keep the work contained. He turned the photograph over in his hands. I used to think it was because she didn't trust me to handle it. Now I think it was because she was trying to protect me. She was probably right, Wren said. I know. He looked up. That doesn't make it easier. No, it wouldn't. He glanced around the cottage then, taking it in properly for the first time, the quilts, the mismatched mugs on their hooks, the stacks of paperbacks with cracked spines, the small framed needlepoint above the stove that said something in Gaelic that Wren had never successfully translated. Her grandmother had claimed it meant home is the place that holds you. But Wren had always suspected she was being loose with the interpretation. This was someone's home, Sebastian said. It wasn't quite a question. My grandmother's. She left it to me when she passed. 3 years ago. You live here alone? In the summers, I work the whale-watching tours out of Cheticamp. In the winters, I write." She paused. "Technical manuals, mostly. Not glamorous, but it pays, and I can do it from here." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "And you just dragged a stranger off the rocks and into your house. You were dying. That doesn't mean most people would have done what you did." "Most people aren't on that path at that hour in November," she said. "I go down to check the mooring rings every autumn before the ice comes. It was luck." "Maybe," he said. She didn't argue. But she'd lived on this coast long enough to have complicated feelings about the difference between luck and the things that chose you. Armand arrived in 43 minutes, which was fast enough that he must have been driving at a speed his doctor would have strongly disapproved of. He came in with the fog at his back and went straight to Sebastian, the way older men go toward the things they've been looking for, without hesitation, without ceremony, simply and directly, and with the weight of years behind them. He sat down and read the brief. He read it twice, slowly, without speaking. Wren made more tea and stayed out of the way. When Armand finally set the document down on her kitchen table, his hands were shaking slightly, not from cold. "Your mother was thorough," he said to Sebastian. "She was always thorough. This names Voss directly, and it names his associate inside the Provincial Justice Ministry, a man named Duplessis." He looked up, and his eyes were very serious. "This is enough. If we can get this to the right people, the right federal people, not the provincial chain, this is enough." "Who's Duplessis?" Wren asked. "Deputy Minister of Justice for Nova Scotia," Armand said. "And the reason every complaint about Voss's companies has disappeared into a drawer for the past 6 years." He looked at her. "He's also the reason I haven't been able to get anyone to look at this without it getting back to Voss within 48 hours. I've been trying to find a path around him for 2 years." "The federal route," Sebastian said. He was sitting up straight now, the hypothermia retreating, something hard and focused replacing it. "There's a federal prosecutor in Ottawa who worked with my mother early in her career. Rene Aute. She'd have jurisdiction if we can demonstrate the interference came from inside the provincial ministry." Armand nodded slowly. "Rene Aute. Yes, I know the name. If we reach her directly." 3 things happened nearly simultaneously. Wren's phone lit up on the kitchen counter. A text from a number she didn't recognize, a single word, wrong, and then another message a second later, wrong house, checking the point, 2 of them, the motion sensor light over the cottage door, the one her grandmother had installed, and which Wren had never once seen trigger on a wildlife false alarm, because it was calibrated correctly, and the Cape Breton deer had learned to avoid it, flooded the front step with white light, and Sebastian was already moving. He was up off the couch before Wren had fully registered the light, the quilt falling away, crossing the room in 4 strides to the window beside the door and pressing himself flat against the wall. He looked at her with those gray eyes, and they were very calm. "Back way out," he said quietly. "Cellar door in the kitchen floor, comes out behind the woodpile. There's a path from there down to the old boat shed. Go." He reached for the poker that leaned against the wood stove. Not ideal, Wren thought distantly. Not ideal, Wren thought distantly. Not ideal at all. "There's a flare gun on the shelf above the cellar door," she said, also quietly. "And my grandfather's old axe handle on the hook beside it. Take the axe handle. If you fire a marine flare inside, you'll burn the cottage down." For 1/2 second, Sebastian Moreau looked at her with an expression she would also carry with her for a long time afterward, because it was the expression of a man who had been operating alone in fear for 14 months and had just, in this kitchen, with these 2 people, realized he wasn't alone anymore. Armand, who was 73 years old and had been a judge for 31 of those years, and had, Wren knew, grown up in a fishing community in Inverness County, and was therefore considerably less breakable than he appeared, was already on his phone. He was speaking in low, rapid French, and from the fragments Wren could catch, he was talking to someone who was going to take this very seriously very quickly. She took the flare gun herself and positioned herself at the corner of the kitchen doorway. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not, Wren would later say, particularly dramatic in the moment. It was the kind of not dramatic that is only possible when everyone is operating on pure necessity and there's no room for anything but the next immediate thing. Two men came around the side of the cottage. Sebastian met the first one at the woodpile with the axe handle and a frankly impressive level of controlled fury. The second man got as far as the cellar entrance before Wren fired the flare into the air above his head. Outside, she'd made it outside first. Thank God for the muscle memory of knowing every door in a house. And the noise and the light brought him to an extremely abrupt stop. The RCMP arrived 22 minutes after Armand's call. Later, sitting on the cottage steps wrapped in the quilt that had ended up outside somehow during the whole affair, Wren watched the lights of the cruisers down on the Point Road and listened to Sebastian talking to the federal officer Armand had reached through a contact in Ottawa, who'd apparently been waiting for exactly this call for over a year. He was steady. He was precise. He told it straight through from the beginning. From the morning the package from his mother arrived at his apartment in Moncton with no return address, through 14 months of being watched and moved and losing jobs and changing cities, to the point 3 weeks ago when he'd understood that the brief was the only leverage that existed, and that the only way to get it somewhere safe was to do it in a way that no one who was watching him would anticipate. He told it straight through, and his voice only faltered once, when he said her name. When he said his mother's name, Constance. Wren looked away to give him that moment. She looked out at the water instead, which was quieting now, the worst of the weather having moved up the coast. The fog was still thick, but the wind had gentled, and somewhere out there a loon was calling, which was unusual this late in the season, but not unheard of. Cape Breton did what it wanted. Armand came and sat beside her on the steps. He was holding his tea mug and looking out at the dark water with the expression of a man who had waited a long time for something and was only now beginning to believe it had actually arrived. Constance Moreau was one of the finest legal minds I encountered in 40 years on the bench, he said, and the bravest person I knew, which is saying something, given that I've known a few. She raised a son like that, Wren said. Armand made a small sound of agreement. She did. They were quiet for a while. The loon called again, farther out now, moving away from the shore. What happens to him now? Wren asked. That depends on how the federal investigation unfolds. But Duplessis will be arrested before sunrise. I'd wager on that. And Voss? Armand shook his head slowly. Voss has been very careful for a very long time, but the brief is specific, documented. Constance didn't leave anything to interpretation. The door behind them opened, and Sebastian came out. He'd found a flannel shirt somewhere inside, one of the ones Wren kept on the back hook for when she came in from the water, and he was wearing it over his thermal undershirt, and he looked like he'd been through exactly what he'd been through, and had arrived somewhere on the other side of it. He sat down on the step below them. For a while, no one said anything. The lights moved on the Point Road. The fog lay soft and white over the water. Somewhere in the cottage, the wood stove was still burning down, radiating a warmth that pressed gently through the walls. I don't know how to thank you, Sebastian said finally. He said it to both of them, but he was looking at Wren. You don't have to, she said. I know I don't have to. His voice was different from when she'd first heard it, less wrecked, less flattened, more his own, she thought, whatever his own sounded like when it wasn't carrying 14 months of fear. I want to. Wren looked at him. There was foam drying in his dark hair from the Atlantic. He had a cut above his right eyebrow from the woodpile encounter that he seemed entirely unbothered by. He looked like a man who had set down something enormously heavy and was still working out what to do with his hands now that they were empty. "My mother," he said carefully, "used to say that the coast gives back what it takes, eventually. It just takes its time about it." He was quiet for a moment. "She grew up in Cheticamp. I think she was talking about the fishing, but I've been thinking about it differently lately." Wren didn't answer right away. She looked out at the water that had very nearly killed him and had, instead, brought him to her door. "The coast gives back what it takes," she said finally. "I'm from here, and I'd say that's about right." Armand stood up, knees cracking, and announced that he was going inside to find somewhere to sit that wasn't a cold step, and that someone should call that woman in Ottawa back with the follow-up information she'd requested, and that there was still half a pot of tea if anyone wanted it. He went in and left the door open behind him. The fog moved. The stars appeared briefly in a gap above the water, cold and very clear, the way they only get in November on the North Atlantic when the air is clean enough to see through properly. "I'm going to have to go to Ottawa," Sebastian said, "for the testimony, and whatever comes after." "I know," Wren said. "And after that—" He stopped, started again. "I haven't had an after that to think about in 14 months. I'm not sure what I'd do with it." Wren pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. The stars were disappearing again, the fog closing back in the way it always did, the way it had her whole life. "You start with the next immediate thing," she said. "That's all you have to do, whatever is right in front of you." He looked at her with those gray eyes that had the color of the water about them, and something else underneath now, something warming. "Right now," he said, "what's right in front of me is you." She didn't look away. She didn't need to. "Then start there," she said. Inside the cottage, the wood stove ticked, and Armand's voice rose and fell in confident French on the phone to Ottawa, and the fog pressed soft and close against the windows of her grandmother's house. And for the first time in a long time, the sound of the wind off the water didn't seem like something to endure. It seemed like something that had always been carrying this particular moment toward her, the way the Atlantic carried everything it meant to deliver, roughly, without apology, and exactly on time.